I say this to my students. I say, like, you want to know what the Nakba is. You want to know what settler colonial campaigns of genocide are.
Look what happens to Gaza.
Yeah, you're seeing it right now. This is what it means to destroy a people.
Do you think there are serious attempts at ending the colonial settlement and the colonial violence against the Palestinian people?
No, I don't.
Plain
In
and
fact,
simple.
plain and simple. I need no further qualifications. No, I don't.
So hello and welcome back to Palestine Deep Dive. Today I'm very privileged to have Sai Englert here with me in the studio. Sai, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Sai Englert is, I will introduce you first. I was very excited to go just to talk about your recent work, but yeah, let's introduce you a little bit to the audience. So Sai Englert is a lecturer at Leiden University in the Netherlands. He works on settler colonialism, Zionism, labor movement, and anti-Semitism. He's a member of the editorial board of Notes from Below and Historical Materialism. And you wrote this book.
I did.
I was reading this book for the past few days, and it's really powerful piece of work about settler colonialism. And you know, we Palestinians, especially me, have been talking a lot about settler colonialism because I understand that we Palestinians, the cause root of all of our problems is colonialism and settler colonialism. But today, I think it's a really good opportunity for us to really understand what settler colonialism is and what colonialism is. Maybe a little bit we'll talk about imperialism. Mm-hmm. And I think you are the best person to talk about all of that.
That's very
So
cool.
First, let me ask you, what motivated you to write this book?
There's a bit of a cop-out response to that question, which is that the person in charge of the Firework series, which is this series that does kind of these short books at Pluto, asked me if I'd be interested in writing it. And so I said I would. But I guess more seriously, there's a huge amount of excellent work that's been done on settler colonialism, to which really in this book, I think I make no contribution. I don't think I add anything new to the literature. And so, when you say I'm the best person, I think there's lots of very, very good people to talk about it. What was striking to me, though, is that the debate or the language of settler colonialism was either limited to academic circles or to very specific activist groups where that language was kind of used and people understood it. I think in general, many of the important liberation struggles, social struggles of our time, whether it, of course, be Palestinian liberation, whether it be confrontations in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, in much of Latin America, around the extraction of natural resources, around climate change, whether it be some of the kind of political conflicts that I think shaped much of the sort of, modern post-collapse of the Soviet Union kind of moment, the Zapatista uprising in Mexico, etc., etc., etc. All of those individual struggles are also shaped by, of course, in very different context, by a shared experience of confronting settler colonial regimes. And so that I think, or my hope was to make that analytical framework and that the general framework to understand all these different struggles within a shared kind of struggle for liberation against settler colonial regimes. I hoped that could be useful for people outside of the networks that already used it.
That's great.
Yeah.
And you did not only write about Palestine, as you mentioned. It's not only Israel, Palestine. You wrote about Latin America. You wrote about India. All of this in this book. But during the past year, and I know you have many friends, many Palestinian friends, and you wrote a little bit about Palestine in this book. So tell me how do you feel about the last year in Palestine, hearing the news about the genocide in Gaza?
I mean, I think we were talking about it a little bit before. I think it's very difficult to put in words. I think the horror we are seeing for the moment is indescribable. I think it generates both a lot of fury at what we're seeing and the way in which our governments, and you said, obviously can't discuss settler colonialism without talking about imperialism, and the way our governments continue to arm, facilitate, give diplomatic cover to the genocide to continue. And I also think there is an element of, in the book, a lot of what I talk about is also genocide, is massacres, is genocide, is campaigns of organized elimination of entire peoples. And I think even in the context of Palestine, I think when we talk about the Nakba, I think there's a way in which we talk about the Nakba for people who talk about it often, that can become quite sort of repetitive in a sense. We say 700,000 people were kicked out of their homes, 500 villages and towns were destroyed, people weren't allowed to return. But, it's almost in a mechanical way. Yeah. And I think partly also over the last year, it's seeing live, minute after minute, exactly what this means. I say this to my students. I say, you want to know what the Nakba is. You want to know what settler colonial campaigns of genocide are.
Look what happens to Gaza.
Yeah, you're seeing it right now. This is what it means to destroy a people. This is the amount of, and I don't think we need to spend any time on them, but there are still those who hold on to entirely discredited ideas that, Palestinians just left or, that things just happen in a war, etc. And actually, I think what we're seeing is the amount of organization, energy, destruction, murder that it takes to disappear a people, to push a people out of their land. It doesn't just happen in war. This is what it looks like. And what it's looked like for the last 500 years of colonial expansion, violence, and murder. I guess what it calls upon us to do both in terms of stopping it in the immediate, but also, and I guess that's part of what I try to do in the book, to think about what are the wider structures of imperialism, of capitalism, of domination that mean that we live in a world in which this keeps happening over and over again. That the only way in which the system can continue to survive is by continuing to project this level of violence on peoples across the world, and the fact that it needs to end.
Yeah, and this book was published in 2022, I think. That was before the genocide in Gaza. And much of what you talked about in this book is genocide and exploitation and elimination of indigenous people. And now we're seeing it live, really happening in Gaza. So much of what I really want to talk about today is the settler colonialism in Palestine. But before we go there, can you please spell out to us the definition of settler colonialism? What is settler colonialism? What is franchise colonialism? And what is colonization?
Yes. So I think, first of all, the thing to say is that colonization is a process of extraction of wealth, of natural resources, through domination on a global scale. And I think it's important to start with there, because there's a tendency to say, well, humans have always oppressed, exploited, conquered, etc. But I think there is something specific at the point in which the world economy shifts from a feudal to a capitalist system, in which the central way in which wealth is generated is no longer through extracting taxes from peasants through agricultural production, but by the circulation of goods, wealth, etc. on a global level, in which wealth is extracted from societies in order to enrich the core, in order to enrich the colonial metropoles. And so first and foremost, colonialism in all of its forms is a strategy of accumulation on a global scale that extracts wealth from one part of the world in order to enrich people in another part of the world. So I think that's the kind of, and that system of exploitation, of extraction, requires conquest and domination. And then the form that conquest or domination takes, I think, changes in different places in different times. And so when we talk about colonialism today, we tend to think about franchise colonialism. So English colonization of India, the Dutch in Indonesia, for example, in which after conquest, domination is largely external. And what I mean by that is that, of course, there are colonial officials, there are colonial armies, but these are not people who go and stay. These are people who go for a particular period of time and maintain an infrastructure, but an infrastructure that is also dependent on the participation of local elites, the mobilization of local police forces, etc., etc., etc. Historically, that form of domination is actually fairly short-lived. So if you look at the debates on colonization in the 19th century, people discussed classic colonization at the time, which is what today we call settler colonialism, which is to say that in order to maintain power over territories that were conquered, in order to make them available for extraction of goods, natural resources, gold, silver, agricultural output, whatever it might be, European powers first, and it's sort of important to say, I guess, that it's not only European powers who colonized. The example of Japan and Korea and Manchuria, for example, in the 19th century is relevant, but at first European powers, and for a very long time, and mainly European powers. Like, I also don't want to give the impression that it's like, oh, everybody's doing it. That in order to maintain their power over lands, they moved populations from the metropole into the lands that they were conquering. And so settler colonialism, as the name, I guess, suggests, is a form of colonization in which control over the territory is maintained by moving a metropolitan population into the land that is being that has been invaded or that is being controlled. And that also means that it generates very different social relations to franchise colonialism, because it means that there is continuously a population which is present, which controls land, which participates in the extraction of resources, etc., and therefore is continuously locked into conflict with the peoples that are being indigenous peoples that are being conquered by the colonial powers. And so that's what settler colonialism is. It's a form of colonization that is dependent for its control over the land on a metropolitan population that is moved into that territory.
For so many years, we have been criticizing the mainstream media, but here at Palestine Deep Dive, we are creating a platform, an alternative in which Palestinian voices are front and center. We are picking the questions, we are picking the guests, and we are leading the conversation. If you like what we do, please consider supporting Palestine Deep Dive. Become a monthly subscriber by donating as little as £1 a month.
Can we trace back the beginning of settler colonialism? When did it start? Who practiced it, the first people? And
yeah, so I mean, I think, as always, there are debates about timelines. I'm not going to go into them here. I think the most straightforward answer really is to say that the discovery of the Americas, I think, is a useful moment to identify. So the end of the 15th century, as the Spanish and the Portuguese fan out of Europe and discover much by chance a new continent that they set to conquer, to dominate, and to settle, to move populations over, which is fundamentally going to transform the balance of power between Europe and other societies on a global level. It is going to transform the internal economic life of Europe, and is going to, by the major transfer of wealth that happens in this process, which is absolutely a genocidal process. I mean, the conquest of the Americas is one of unabated bloodshed and murder on a continental level. I mean, today historians talk about 90% of the populations of the Americas being eliminated through the process of settlement and conquest that goes on for centuries. But that, I think that moment really identifies the moment where a new form of domination emerges, which is a domination that is unconcerned about maintaining any form of social, political, or economic life in the lands that are being conquered, and operates on the basis of mass elimination, both through direct warfare, through the spreading of diseases, and the putting of work of indigenous populations on land, in mines, etc., absolutely with the idea that their disappearance, their murdering them through work, is of no consequences, because the idea is very much the enrichment of the metropole, the colonial metropole, at the expense of the lands that are being settled.
Yes, and when we talk about settler colonialism, we don't talk about a group of people leaving their country and going to another empty space to settle. They leave their countries and go to another country, another space that is full of indigenous people. So tell me a little bit about this indigenous people. What is the definition of indigenous?
Well, so that's a complicated question. It might seem straightforward. On the one hand, you could simply say, well, it's people that are already in the lands that are being conquered. And I think you're absolutely right to really underline the fact that we have over and over and over again the language being mobilized by settlers that the lands in which they arrive are empty. And so people might be familiar that this is something the Zionists say, right? So they'll say that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land, while at the same time, and maybe we can talk about that later, spending the entire time discussing amongst themselves what they're going to do with the Palestinians. So very much actually acknowledging that there is a people there and that that's a political problem for the project of settlement. But that's absolutely not something that's specific about Zionists. So if you read the Boer settlers in South Africa, if you read the English settling the Americas, if you read the Spaniards in the Americas, etc., 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 everybody talks about empty lands. And that's, on the one hand, an ideological trick. On the other hand, it also speaks of racism, right? And the idea that the populations that are being conquered cannot be recognized as people. They cannot be recognized as humans. They're sort of being discussed as part of
human animals, maybe.
Human animals gets used. People without souls. There are big debates within the Iberian Peninsula for much of the first, the 15th, and then certainly in the 16th century about who exactly has a soul, right? So ideas of difference are constructed religiously, still primarily at the time, more than biologically, although biological difference is emerging. And so the idea is, who has a soul? Do Africans have a soul? And if not, can they be enslaved? Do indigenous people have a soul? And if not, can they be enslaved? If they have a soul, what kind of soul do they have? Is it really the same? Etc., etc., etc. But the bottom line is, these people can't quite be recognized as human. And so both their murder can be justified, the taking of their land can be justified, putting them to work in impossible, murderous conditions can be justified. But on the one hand, I think there is simply that. There is the question that there is a moment of conquest and of settlement in which one population settles the land of a population that already exists. I think, however, it's also important to recognize that the idea of indigeneity is the political outcome of colonization. Which is to say that the peoples that are being conquered, if we think about the Americas, are people that form, before the arrival of Europeans, many different societies, many different nations, many different tribes, many different forms of social, political, and economic life that don't necessarily think of themselves as being part of a unified group. They do commerce, they wage war, they have forms of exchange, as all societies do. And it is the process of colonization that imposes on them a collective identity. An identity which says that rights, access to land, access to life, access to resources, the right to own property, to own land, to have collective claims over the territory, etc., that those rights are being divided or assigned unequally, dependent on whether people are being identified by the colonial state as either settler or indigenous. And so to be a settler is having the right to murder, to conquer, to claim property, and to be indigenous is to have the right to be conquered, be murdered, be dispossessed. And I think it's also important to identify that political question, because throughout the history of settler colonialism, simply the division of who was where when gets complicated. So, for example, the French in North Africa, as they settle, run into the problem that they don't have enough settlers. One of the ways they deal with that is to deal differently with different religious communities. And so at the very time where they impose a legal order, which they call the Code of Indigeneity, so in which they basically lay down the rules on which the indigenous population is going to be dominated, they also say that the Jewish populations of North Africa are going to be integrated into the French population. They all become French. They have no say in it, by the way. It is imposed on them just as colonization is imposed on everybody else. Okay. They become French. And so the French state attempts to integrate populations that are local into the settler population. Similar things happen in Palestine, by the way, with the Jewish populations, the Palestinian Jewish populations, and how the Zionist movement goes about. And you can think of lots of examples. The Irish populations that were indigenous and colonized in Ireland that are turned into settlers as they are being brought over to the Americas, where they participate in the settlement of land. So I think it's important to hold on to the political nature of the division between the settler and the indigenous. And the last thing I'll say on this is that it's also political in the other direction, which is that it's not only that settlers get to impose this on indigenous populations, it's also that indigenous populations start developing collective forms of identity in struggle for liberation. Is they start saying, well, we might have thought ourselves historically as separate nations or whatever it might be. Although, of course, not always. There's also lots of forms of communal identities, collective identities. But that they start saying everybody that faces this form of domination has a shared interest in overthrowing it. And so that to start thinking of ourselves as indigenous as opposed to the people that control us or that dominate us also gives us power, gives us an ability. And so you see lots throughout history and times and places, lots of ways in which people think about what collective forms of identity can be constructed, not simply as on the receiving end of colonialism, but also in how settler colonialism or colonialism can be overthrown.
Okay, how does the concept of settler colonialism apply actually on the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian people? Because some people, not only Jewish people, some other people think that the Zionist movement or the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian land is just the Jewish people returning to their lands. So is it really fair to say that what Israel is doing in Palestine is settler colonialism, or just we as pro-Palestinians or Palestinians just accuse Israel of something that they didn't do?
Right. So that's unfortunately very much what is becoming a dominant argument amongst pro-Israeli actors, which is that basically settler colonialism is a slur. It doesn't actually describe anything historically or materially specific. It's just a slur, something that's bad, and it gets thrown around. And because Palestinians and their allies want to defeat Israel, they throw around this slur that's totally not applicable. In fact, people get away with writing, I think, outrageous things. There's a book out, I won't name it to not give it publicity now, but that focuses on settler colonialism and claims that the idea emerged 20 years ago in the Americas and Australia. Whereas we know, for example, that certainly the Palestinian National Liberation Movement was publishing in their research center in Beirut throughout the 60s and 70s, excellent books that taught about settler colonialism, both in terms of Zionism in Palestine and compared it to what was happening in the African continent, particularly in terms of the liberation struggles in Southern Africa and Algeria. But not only that, so not only has this always been part of the language of the Palestinian national liberation movement that talked about the specific type of enemy it faced and how that linked to the struggles of other. So again, what I was saying about how people construct connections through the idea of indigeneity, right? So how indigenous people who are faced by settler colonial powers, start building alliances and say, the enemy you're facing is the enemy we're facing too. But the Zionists talked about settler colonialism all the time. And I think this is really important to kind of hammer home, which is that Zionism emerges in the late 19th century amongst bourgeois and petit bourgeois Jewish thinkers, very much assimilated into European life. Much to the chagrin of anti-Semites, actually, right? Is that these are really Europeans. They're absolutely European. And so they think like Europeans. And because they think like Europeans, bourgeois Europeans in the late 19th century, they think, A, that colonization is absolutely not a problem, that Europe solving its social problems abroad through colonization is absolutely not a problem. And they talk about their own project very clearly as colonial. So if you read The Jewish State, which is the book written by Theodor Herzl, who's both an early theoretician of Zionism and an early, really the kind of the father figure of the Zionist organization. So he moves from theory to practice. He writes a book and then thinks about how do we actually make this happen. Theodor Herzl talks about the Zionist project absolutely as being a colonial project. The first financial tool of the Zionist organization that is set up to make settlement possible in Palestine is called the Jewish Colonial Trust. The Moshavim, which are the first kind of collective farms built, Moshavim comes from the Hebrew word for colony, Moshava. Over and over again, if you read very famously Jabotinsky's text, The Iron Wall, where he talks about what the Zionist policy should be towards the Palestinians, he absolutely talks about colonialism. And in fact, he says, look at what indigenous people did all over the world. He calls them native, but all over the world, they resisted. So the Palestinians will resist our attempts to colonize them also, and therefore we must crush them. In fact, if you look at the debates in the Zionist movement between the different wings of the Zionist movement, the debate is not about colonization or not colonization. Everybody agrees. The question is what kind of colonization? And so you get sort of bourgeois Zionists who say, we should be South Africa. In fact, Herzl loves Cecil Rhodes, central to British colonization in South Africa and then in what is today Zimbabwe and Zambia, writes to him and he says, asks him for his support in his attempt to convince the British to support Zionism. And he says, you know, this is a very different part of the world than the part of the world you're interested in, but it's a thing colonial. And therefore you'll be interested and you know what we're talking about. So South Africa will be an example. Other people will look at Algeria and French colonization of Algeria. And so you have a camp in the Zionist movement that will say our colonization should be like that. We should be a minority of landlords who exploit a majority of Palestinians. That will be able to hyper exploit and therefore build an economy where we produce cheaply in Palestine and export to Europe. Against that, other people say, and that's kind of the labor Zionist, the so-called Israeli left, that will say, look at these places. It's a catastrophe. Indigenous people keep rebelling. And because the colonial economy is dependent on them, every time they rebel, they're able to shut down their economies. So we should absolutely not do that. We should build a state in which we kick the Palestinians out and in which we are only dependent on ourselves. And that debate is really the formative debate of the Zionist movement. So again, what I was saying before, while they're saying this is a land without a people, they're actually busy having debates on very much on what to do with the Palestinians, and a debate which is entirely operates entirely within the language of colonialism. They all recognize that what they're doing is settling and colonizing Palestine. And this goes very late. So I have an original version of a newspaper, an Israeli newspaper that was published in French. So it was directed at the French public, that published in 1958. 1958, so it's fairly late. In 1958, they published a special issue to celebrate 10 years of the existence of the Israeli state that is directed to the French public to encourage greater economic and political collaboration.
Okay.
In Israeli newspaper of 1958, they described the spread of new moshavim and kibbutzim, so the farms inside of Israel. So within the Green Line, they describe it as the advance of colonization. They talk about agricultural colonization. They talk about advancing colonization. They talk about settlers. They talk absolutely within the language of colonization. And so Zionism until, and this is after the creation of the state within its own borders. So they entirely understand themselves as a colonial project. And it is only with the rise of anti-colonial movement, the defeat of other colonies around the world, the shifts that generates and how acceptable the idea of colonialism might be inside of Europe and inside of the West, etc., that Zionism is going to distance itself from colonialism and is going to kind of consider that that's not a word it can use. But simply looking at the Zionist sources, the debate is sort of settled. The Zionists understood that they were settling. They understood themselves as part of a global European tradition of settler colonialism. They were learning the lessons of this form of colonialism in order to make their colonial project as effective as possible.
Some people would argue that what you have said is true, but only for a few Israeli Zionist leaders. That happened in the past. And now the majority of the Israelis, or the vast majority of the Israelis, think of the Israeli state as, or think of them as indigenous to the land of Palestine because they have lived there like 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. And that them settling in Palestine is just them claiming their lands back. How do you see this?
So, in a sense, I'm not so concerned. I'm interested, but I'm not so concerned in terms of defining what's going on, of how people talk about it. What I'm interested at is what's actually happening.
Okay.
On a very superficial level, but I think it's not irrelevant, I think it's sort of extraordinary that we are supposed to believe that a state which has nearly 1 million settlers
in the West Bank,
in the East Jerusalem, so it's not to say anything about the whole project, but even just that, in the West Bank in East Jerusalem and in the Golan Heights, is not a settler colony. Who are these people? What are they doing if not settling and colonizing land? So I think it's kind of a superficial argument, but I think it's not an unimportant one, because I think there's a real ideological dissonance where we're supposed to accept both that and the fact that it's not a process of settlement. But more fundamentally, and that comes back to what I was saying before, I think if we understand settler colonization as an ongoing process of maintaining land, and that the division between indigenous and settler populations is not about who is born where, when, but is about what rights do states give to one population and to another, hence why the language of apartheid is relevant. Because one population is constructed as a settler population, it has the right to take land. We're seeing it very directly. Jewish Israeli populations are protected by their state in the process of dispossessing Palestinians, in taking their land, in taking their property, in taking their life. And we're seeing it in front of us. That is structurally, materially embedded in the legal system. Palestinians, on the other hand, are by law defined as populations that can be dispossessed, can be kicked off their land, can be murdered by a settler population. And so if we think about that material relation as being the fundamental relation that structures life, it's sort of unimportant whether Israelis think of themselves as coming back or as conquering, or whether Israelis say, well, you know, we've been here now for however many generations, so we're local, etc. That's not the question. The question is, under what conditions are you there? What is the legal material structure that allows you to be there in such a way that you are there on the basis of making the Palestinian society disappear?
Well, one of these spaces, and I heard it from many people who are not even Jewish or Christians, and they told me that Israel should be there. The Jewish people should live in Israel, in Palestine, because God promised them this land. And as I said, it's not only the Jewish people who say that. There are many, many Christians who believe in that. Is religion here a legitimate base for this narrative?
So not only do I think it's not legitimate, I think it's misdirection. What I mean by that is that, of course, Jewish people have thought throughout history of Palestine as being religiously significant for them. But they've thought about that relation in very different ways at different times in history. So famously, Jewish writers in the 16th century in Safad write of themselves as being in exile. So they write from Safad in exile. Why? Because they think of the religious in a particular religious tradition. So it's not important where they are. The question of exile is understood religiously, and therefore the idea of return, if it existed, is also understood religiously. What's different about Zionism, which by the way is until fairly recently an aggressively anti-religious movement, but is not so much the religious argument, did God or did God not promise Palestine to the Jewish people, which is kind of a debate I'm not that interested in. The question is that the political project becomes one of building a nation state, one, that nation state will be a Jewish nation state, two, and that the building of that Jewish nation state will happen on Palestinian land and at the detriment of Palestinian people. And so the question of did God promise Palestine to the Jews, yes or no, is irrelevant. The question is, how are people mobilizing that idea for a particular political project? And the problem is the particular political project. The particular political project, which is an ethno-national state built at the detriment of the Palestinians.
And by the way, not only the Palestinians, because I don't know if you saw the headlines at the Jerusalem Post a few days ago, and the headline was, "Is Lebanon part of the promised land of Israel?" So it's not only a settler colonial project, but it's also an expansionist settler colonial project.
Yes.
So we're not talking about Palestinians now. Maybe in the future, if they have the power, they will move.
But
to
not even
Lebanon.
Just in terms of the future. The Golan Heights is settled, which is Syrian. The Sinai Desert was settled for a whole time until the so-called peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. We talked about Jabotinsky before in revisionist Zionism. The revisionists, which are the kind of ideological current that gave birth to the Likud and people like Netanyahu, considered the land, the promised land, to run from the Nile to the Euphrates. And so, but I think that's always part of the settler colonial states, is the question of expansion, is that they expand until they are stopped, right? Until they can't expand further because they are defeated, because they are stopped geographically, because their state is overthrown. I mean, whatever it might be. But they expand is that, we tend to think very comfortably in categories of nation states. So we think the United States is one place, South Africa is one place, Algeria is one place. What happens always is that people start conquering a small part of land, often a port, because they arrive by boat. And so they take a city or they take a piece of land by the water. And in the process, they displace indigenous people in order to claim land. And that generates conflict. In the process of conflict, they're either defeated or they defeat indigenous people and drive them back further, taking more land, which allows the settler colony to grow. As the settler colony grows, it needs more land because it needs to feed a larger group of people. It needs to house them. It needs to build infrastructure, etc. So it continues expanding. In expansion, it continues to enter into conflict with indigenous people, that it enters into conflict with, etc., etc., etc. And so, for example, it's pretty clear, I think, from early French writings that as they start colonizing North Africa, they're not really thinking about colonizing what is today the full territory of Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. They are trying to lay claim over the key ports in the Mediterranean from which Ottoman corsairs are able to launch military operations against European ships. And so it's about controlling trade routes. And so we're back to the question of circulation of goods and accumulation on a global scale. But once they lay claim on those cities, they conquer those cities, they enter into conflict with indigenous populations. Because they enter into conflict with indigenous populations, they start expanding the amount of land they control. As they expand, they start thinking, this is pretty good agricultural land. maybe we could move people there, they could work it, etc., etc., etc. And so you get into a logic. And I think that's also what we're seeing very much with Zionism, is that there isn't really a limit beyond the limits that is imposed. And I think part of what we're seeing for the moment is an extremely aggressive, murderous and bloody attempt, and so far successful attempt, by the Israeli state to redraw the worlds of possibles. What is possible?
Yeah.
How much can be taken, under what conditions, how directly, how much Palestinians can be either eliminated or expelled.
Yeah.
The
What
same
is
for the
possible and what is
Lebanese.
acceptable by the international community
Absolutely.
as well. Because a year ago, no one could fathom the fact that bombing hospitals could be allowed. And now it is allowed. Israel bombed all the hospitals.
Yes.
It has become acceptable to bomb a hospital. But my question to you, we have been talking about the driving forces and the motives of the settler colonizers. But what is the driving force behind the Zionist movement? Why did they choose Palestine? Why did they want to come to Palestine?
So I think, and here we're back to the question of both capitalism and imperialism, is that I think there is a danger, and I try to not do that in the book, to understand settler colonialism only internally. So only what's happening in the process of settlement. And that's super important. Like, I'm not at all, I talk about it a lot as well.
Yeah.
But I think first we have to say what I started with. Settler colonialism is a form of imperial control that is important or useful because it allows the accumulation of capital, the accumulation of wealth, of goods, the exploitation of peoples, the accumulation of land on a global scale. And I think that really has to be our starting point, because it also allows us to think always about the relation between settlers, settler colonies, and the empire. And for example, and maybe we'll talk about it more, I think you cannot understand what's happening in Palestine without understanding European and American imperialism. That is the only reason why any of this is possible. The interest of European and American powers. So why Palestine?
Are you saying that Zionism or the Israeli state is a project of the Western colonization?
Absolutely. I think without that, Zionism never gets off the ground and is certainly never successful. What do I mean by that? Why is Palestine interesting? Why is Palestine important? Palestine is a key strategic place at the crossroads of three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. It is from the mid-19th century next to the Suez Canal, which remains the most important thoroughfare of world trade, maritime world trade. It is at the gates of the Mediterranean for a region that is full of oil and natural gas. So one of the reasons why the British want Palestine is because they can build pipelines that run from Kirkuk to Haifa. And from Haifa, they can get the oil onto boats and get it into Europe. Yeah. So Palestine is important because it is at this absolutely key strategic point in the world economy. And in fact, I think that's a very old question. I think it's very difficult to understand the Crusades, for example, without understanding European attempts at controlling what are at the time the most important trade routes in the world. We're always told that it's about religion, except it's very difficult to understand it if you only think about religion, because as the European Christians arrive in Constantinople or in Jerusalem, they keep sacking churches and taking all the gold and the silver out of them, etc. So if you're just thinking about it as a religious thing, it gets quite confusing. It's an attempt at controlling key trade routes, and not just for Europeans, for any empire that was built. Palestine is an absolutely key place in that. And the Zionists understood this. So the central concern for Herzl, already in his book, The Jewish State, and then for the Zionist organization, is twofold. One is to say, and he's clear about this in the book, indigenous people will revolt. In fact, he talks about other attempts at settling in different parts of the world. So he talks about Argentina, for example. And he says the problem when people settle is that indigenous people revolt. And in order to deal with that, we need for our settlement to be organized and to be protected. And if it's going to be organized and protected, we need the support of a European power, of a great power, as he calls it. And so Herzl's main political concern is going to be how to win over a European power, that he tries the Ottomans briefly and realizes it's not going anywhere. So a European power, in fact, let's not get into it, but in the late 19th century, people think of the Ottomans as a European power, but whatever, to support Zionism. And so he's going to speak to the Russian Tsar, to the German Kaiser, to the French, to the British. He's trying, and so is the Zionist movement, to convince a great power to support Zionism. And his claim is twofold. One, and he famously writes in his notebooks, the anti-Semites will be our greatest allies, the anti-Semitic nations our closest friends, or the other way around, but whatever, it doesn't matter. Why? Because he's going to say to what are extremely anti-Semitic states, you don't want the Jews in Europe, we have a solution for you. And the second thing he's going to say is you want Palestine, and we have a solution for you. And that language is one you are going to see over and over again. So very famously, Sir Ronald Storrs, who's the first British governor of Palestine, will explain British support for Zionism by saying that Zionism is the construction of a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. So,
Wow.
which is interesting in two ways. One, he makes the comparison with Ulster. So he makes the comparison with settlement in Ireland and British colonization of Ireland. And two, what he's saying is we are building a military outpost in a region that we are trying to control, which is another reason why trying to understand Zionism only internally and not as a regional project, and makes it very difficult, for example, to understand what's happening now or what happened in the wars with Arab nationalism, is that Israel is acting on behalf of Western powers. Herzl describes it as a rampart of the West against barbarism in Asia. Something like that. I'm not quite getting the quote right, but it's and so it's the imposition of European power in the region. And the British understand it like that. They say we are supporting Zionism because it's allowing us to impose our control in a key region in the world. In the 1970s, Haig, who was the American Secretary of State, says that Zionism is an unsinkable American aircraft carrier in which not a single American soldier needs to be used, right? So again, he's saying this is our military base that allows us to defeat our enemies without us having to do it directly. And that's why Palestine is so important, because of the strategic position that Palestine holds. At the same time, and I think this is useful in terms of some of the other contemporary debates, European anti-Semitism is crucial here, exactly for this reason, that it allows the idea of getting rid of the Jews while strengthening European power abroad. And so the Balfour Declaration is famous. It's the moment where the British government officially says that it will support the Zionist movement. Arthur Balfour is a famous anti-Semite. In 1905, he passes a law, the Aliens Act, that tries to stop Jewish migration from Eastern Europe into Britain. The debates in the British government at the time are filled with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and the idea that if you give the Jews Palestine, they will be attached to the war effort, etc. And this, again, is something we see over and over and over again in the settler colonial world, which is that oppressed minorities are turned into the vanguard in Europe, are turned into the vanguard of colonial expansion abroad. So I teach in Leiden, as you said. Leiden prides itself on being the place from which the pilgrims left to settle in the Americas. American presidents come and pray in the cathedral in Leiden. If you go to Leiden, there are bookshops and hotels that are called the Mayflower, after the boat that took them to settle, etc., etc., etc. What is the story of the pilgrims? They're an oppressed religious minority in England who flee from oppression by the king to the Netherlands, where they have greater religious freedom, until the moment where the Netherlands and England enter into an alliance to fight the Spanish. So the English demand that the Dutch will repress this minority, which is printing pamphlets in the Netherlands, which it's sending back to England. And under that repression, half of them decide that actually they are going to go to the quote unquote new world and build their perfect society there. In doing that, they become, from being an oppressed religious group, they turn into the representatives of European power into new lands to settle. And you see that over and over and over again. When the French state represses in the 19th century the Paris Commune, many of the communards are sent to Algeria, where they turn into settlers. People might know the Torpedo Martyrs in England, who are an early group of people who sort of are seen as the kind of ancestors of the modern trade union movement. When they are repressed by the British state, they are sent to Australia. And so over and over again, you have this thing that political, religious, ethnic groups that are unwanted at home are sent abroad. And it's a kind of two birds in one stone. You get rid of a group that you don't want at home and you strengthen your power abroad. Zionism is that for its imperial supporters. It's both getting rid of a group they didn't want at home, the Jewish people, and strengthening power over a crucial strategic place in the world economy. And it remains that. I think you cannot understand Zionism and you cannot understand what's happening in terms of Israeli power, Israeli impunity, support for Israel, including in this time of genocide, without understanding that what Israel is doing is that it is doing the dirty work for the imperial powers that are supporting it, primarily today the United States, but also the other Western powers that have interest in the Middle East.
What does Zionism mean to you personally?
Zionism to me means a project of building a Jewish nation state. I think that's really important, nation state bit. A Jewish nation state, an exclusive Jewish nation state in Palestine. And people like to say many of the parts of that definition were up for debate. So some people didn't want Palestine. People talked about Argentina. People talked about East Africa. There were different plans at different moments. People like to say it didn't always have to be a nation state. Some people, but really they're pre-Zionists, talked about going back to Palestine in order to rebuild Jewish communal life, often religious Jewish communal life in Palestine. People like to say it didn't have to be ethnically homogeneous. You know, some bits of the Zionist movement believed that some form of coexistence with the Palestinians was possible. All of that is true. Except we are talking, on the one hand, about extremely small minorities, and two, about minorities that never carried the day. There was at no point a moment in which any of those people dominated the Zionist organization, were the most powerful force within the settlements in Palestine. Their political project was never the organizing principle of Zionism. And so I think it's really this question of a exclusive Jewish nation state in Palestine is what Zionism, for all attempts and purposes, is and has been since the late 19th century.
So Patrick Wolfe's definition of settler colonialism is often quoted as the most authoritative definition, but in your book you take issues with the way he defines it. Can you explain what is the difference between your definition to settler colonialism and his?
So Patrick Wolfe becomes very, very important in the very end of the 1990s, early 2000s, as somebody who really brings questions of studying settler colonialism as a particular academic field to the fore. He writes a number of really important books and becomes really the central figure in contemporary settler colonial studies. Now, I've already said that there's lots of people writing about it well before him. And in fact, I think that's something Patrick Wolfe would have, he passed away, but, it's certainly not something he would have sort of disputed or anything. Indigenous studies, largely in North America, but not only, also in North America and in Australia and New Zealand, many people wrote about it. Of course, very important political movements in the 60s and 70s. We talked about the Palestinian national movement already, indigenous movements in North America, etc. So lots of other people had already and continue to approach it in different ways. But within within settler colonial studies, Patrick Wolfe's definition becomes very dominant. And particularly Patrick Wolfe and then others after him put a really big emphasis on the question of elimination. So because of what I said before, that settler colonies are defined by the arrival of populations that stay, that settle, and therefore enter into an ongoing conflict with indigenous populations. And so Patrick Wolfe and others will say that what that relationship generates is a drive to eliminate. So that settler colonies are defined by their drive to eliminate, to do away with indigenous people and their societies because they need to in order to establish control over the land. And he looks at how that elimination takes place, certainly through direct physical elimination, but also through a whole number of other things, miscegenation, so the kind of the racist blood calculations that settlers would define, at what point people stop being indigenous because they have enough white blood in them. Obviously, all of that is nonsense, but it's a political way to pull people out of collective claims over land by sort of forcefully integrating them into the settler population. People might know about the boarding schools in North America, where indigenous children were taken from their families and sort of forcefully educated out of being indigenous. So they, weren't allowed to wear indigenous clothes or hairstyles, speak indigenous languages, practice their religions. Very, very violent schools. Many children died there. The slogan of the kind of the foundational school was "Kill the Indian, save the man." Right, so that was the idea. So
for them, the Indian is not a man.
Exactly, and so to kind of disappear, and so that elimination could take loads of forms, and so that was the kind of the main claim that Patrick Wolfe made. And Patrick Wolfe and then other people after him, particularly somebody called Lorenzo Veracini, made that the differentiation. So the first question you asked me was, what's the difference between settler colonialism and franchise colonialism? They would say the difference is elimination and exploitation. So they said colonialism exploits, it conquers, and then it puts people in the colonies to work for the metropole. Settler colonialism eliminates. It tries to do away with indigenous people in order to lay claim on land. And because land is so central, elimination is the definitional act of settler colonialism. And that's the kind of the part that I took or that I disagree with. Not at all because I disagree that elimination is a massive part of the settler colonial story. It very clearly is. And certainly in the places where people like Wolfe and Veracini really focused on, Canada, in terms of today, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, very clearly these are societies that are built on the mass genocidal elimination of indigenous populations and their replacement by settler populations. The way I disagree with it is in several directions. One is to say elimination is really a feature of all colonial projects. Is that we see mass genocidal campaigns in franchise colonies, the so-called famines in India, for example, which are not famines. There's lots of food. It's just the food is pulled out of the country and exported to the markets of Britain and the world, while millions of people are allowed to die of hunger. There's a wonderful book by Mike Davis called The Victorian Holocaust, which looks at how the kind of different famines of the late 19th century played themselves out in different colonial relations. Of course, the question of enslavement is also a massive form of elimination. There's lots of forms of elimination within the colonial world in general, and that are not epiphenomena, like they are central to maintaining power, is mass campaigns of murder and huge amounts of violence on a regular basis. That's a kind of a smaller side, but I think it's important. My bigger disagreement was to say that actually, because of making elimination the definition, two things happen. One is that the amount of settler colonies that literature tend to look at becomes very small. Because they look at the societies that were built on elimination. And I actually think that there are many settler colonies where exploitation was central and potentially more definitional than elimination. So much of settler colonies in the African continent weren't able to overwhelm indigenous populations and to replace them with settlers. The French in Algeria, the British in Kenya, the Dutch and then the British in South Africa, etc., etc., etc. These are societies where minority settlers ruled over majority indigenous populations which were central to the running of the settler colony and its economy. It was the exploitation of indigenous populations that made it, that defined the economic and political model of those societies. It's largely true for many societies in Latin America, where indigenous labor exploitation was in fact central. And in fact, sometimes exploitation was, and we've talked about this already a little bit, was the way in which elimination took place. So sending indigenous people in Bolivia, for example, to work and die in the mines of Bolivia, not only Bolivia, but as an example, was a way in which both elimination and exploitation take place at the same time.
And so also in Palestine, it's the same thing. When you describe the Nakba and the Naksa, 1948 and 1967, the first one was elimination and the other one was exploitation.
Yes, and in fact, this leads to other problems. So Veracini famously, I don't know if this is still a position he holds, but it's a useful example, argued that Israeli colonization within the 48 borders was settler colonialism because it eliminated, and within the 67 borders was franchise colonialism because it exploited, which I think obscures the fact that there is an ongoing process of settlement that's taking place across historic Palestine, but has different modalities because of Palestinian resistance, because of the balance of forces, because the available of the amount of settlers that are available at different periods of time, because the economic needs of the settler state, etc., etc., etc. And you see throughout the history of Zionism this pendulum swinging between the two. And I already talked about the fact that the early debates in the Zionist movement were about that. Should it be an exploiting settlement or an eliminating settlement? After 1948, clearly the Zionist movement gets closest through the Nakba to the goal of elimination. By the mid-60s, it lacks labor. It has major labor shortages. It's not very clear where it's going to get new settlers from. And so the expansion over the whole of historic Palestine undoes, in a sense, if I can say it like that, the work of the Nakba. Because now more land means more Palestinians. And actually those Palestinians are integrated into the Israeli economy. What that creates is exactly what the labor Zionists warned about in the 20s and 30s, which is that Palestinians are able to mobilize their economic power to put pressure on the colonial machine. So in the first Intifada, you have strikes, you have stayaways, you have economic pressure, even if it's only in certain industries, in construction, in agriculture, in like some low level, low technological levels of industry, etc. Palestinians are able to put economic pressure on the Israelis. So after the first Intifada, in response to Palestinian resistance, the Israeli Labour Party comes back to power, and the two-state solution is partly this. It's about regional relations, but it's also about that. It's about how to re-separate and to keep Palestinians out of the Israeli economy. They tried to replace Palestinians with migrant workers. And in the second Intifada, the fact that Palestinians have been cut out of the economy, there's huge levels of poverty. And so what the Israeli secret services and the army consider to be a weakness, because they say we no longer have an economic way to discipline the Palestinians and to get some money into the Palestinian economy, which will keep Palestinians quiet. So they start reintegrating them again. What we're seeing now is again a drive to certainly eliminate in terms of the genocide in Gaza, but also arguments about replacing Palestinian workers in the Israeli economy. And this is a good argument, I think, or a good illustration of my argument, which is to say that the question of what shape the settler colony takes is one that is fought over. It is fought over between settlers. It is sometimes fought over between settlers and the colonial metropole. It is fought over, crucially, with indigenous populations and the kind of the levels of resistance making particular forms of colonization possible or not possible. And part of what I'm trying to say is that we should remain open and engaged with how these struggles shape the particular colonial project. In fact, in some places, it shaped the nature of whether we're talking about franchise or settler colonies. That division is also not entirely. So the example I gave of the French in North Africa, the French first talked not at all about settling North Africa, but about colonizing the coasts. Then they talked about settlement, and they talked a lot in Algeria about the possibility of eliminating the indigenous population. And then they ended up not being able to do that because of indigenous resistance, because of the lack of available settlers to kind of overwhelm indigenous populations, etc. And so they settled for an economy based on exploitation of the Algerian majority in the countryside. And so that I don't think it's just the kind of a theoretical argument, elimination or exploitation, but actually I think it opens up the way to think about colonial history in greater, more dynamically, to include more of the settler colonial world, which I try to do in the book, and to think more dynamically about how settler colonies are actually shaped through process of struggle, of resistance, of confrontation. And the other aspect is that it allows greater space to think about decolonization. I think there is a very big emphasis in Wolfe and then others after him on the stability of settler colonies. He says because settler colonies eliminate, they are more stable than franchise colonies, because in franchise colonies,
the resistance.
Yes, and the colonized were able to organize national liberation movements, to go on strike, to shut down the economy, to force the colonizers out. And he says, look at North America, at Oceania, etc. These are societies that have survived the waves of decolonization that we saw in the second half of the 20th century, and they did so because they were built on elimination. Now that's partly true. Well, it's certainly true in terms of those societies, but what it misses is that lots of settler colonies didn't survive the wave of decolonization of the second half of the 20th century. So Mahmoud Mamdani famously describes Africa as the continent where settler colonialism failed. And partly that's to do with the fact that indigenous populations that were being exploited and were the vast majority in their societies were able to overthrow their settler regimes. In Latin America, where you're somewhere between elimination in some places and at some times exploitation in other places and in other times, you have massive presence of indigenous movements in ecological struggles, in labor struggles, in peasant struggles that have generated very different social formations and balances of power. And in fact, what we're seeing in Latin America for the last 30 years is a central role of indigenous movements in all the radical attempts, with all their contradictions and their problems, of establishing control over different states and the kind of, the progressive governments that have come to power there. And so I think by not creating a sharp division where we say only the states that eliminate are settler colonial, we get a better reading of the dynamism and the centrality of struggle in the history of settler colonialism, and we get a better reading of what different paths to liberation might look like.
Can we say that settler colonialism in North America succeeded to eliminate the indigenous people?
So I think we have to be very careful with that. Because on the one hand, of course, it's been extremely genocidal. And, we already talked about
90% of the
amount of people that were eliminated, and, histories and nations and people that were displaced, murdered, dispossessed, etc., and terrible consequences. At the same time, we are still talking about millions of people today in North America.
3 million people, I think,
yes,
who survived.
And even that number is one that is complicated. So, for example, I talked about the blood quantums. So the colonial imposition of at what point somebody stops being indigenous means that there's lots of people that might be considered or consider themselves as indigenous that are excluded of the calculus because of the ongoing prevalence of racial categories that are linked to blood. So very famously in the 60s, 70s, I can't exactly remember when it's established, the American Indian movement, which is a kind of a radical movement for indigenous rights, it emerges. And what's interesting is that it emerges largely in cities amongst people who had been counted as no longer indigenous because they'd been integrated into the kind of the general settler population. But those people rejected the imposition of those colonial identities and very much said we're still indigenous. Many people who'd gone through the boarding schools, for example, and who said they might consider us no longer as indigenous, but we still consider ourselves as indigenous. So first of all, people are still there. They're still fighting, and in really central ways. So for example, everywhere, both in the United States and in Canada, where gas and oil is being extracted, where pipelines are being built, where kind of this infrastructure of ecological catastrophe actually is being developed, and where natural resources are being extracted in order to accumulate capital, which we talked about before. The question of settler colonialism is central. It's the central question. You can see a direct confrontation between the settler colonial state and indigenous populations. And so I think we have to be very careful at writing off populations as finally defeated. And it's not just in those societies either. In Australia and New Zealand, the question of settler colonialism and of indigenous liberation keeps reappearing as absolutely central to lots of kind of different political and economic questions in those societies. And so they, of course, operate in very different terrain because of the history that they've gone through than, let's say, the Palestinians, where, you know, the vast majority of Palestinians survived the process. And, you know, it's something that Arafat used to talk about in the 90s, you know, that one of the victories of the national movement was that Palestinians survived in lots of, you know, displaced, occupied, colonized, etc., but they survived and remained, despite the kind of ideas that Zionists had early on that the Palestinians would just disappear into the general population of Arab lands around them. So they're different material circumstances, but they are very much united by an ongoing, and I think it's really important to say that there are ongoing struggles for national liberation in their separate context.
Now, you talked a lot about the metropole of the colonial, settler colonial powers. What do you mean by that, really?
So I mean, you know, let's say the home country or the center of empire, right? So
it's easy to understand it now when we talk about the colonialism of Britain and the colonies of Britain in India, for example, or other places. But when we talk about Israel, what is the metropole of Israel?
Well, so that's complicated. You're right. And so Zionists, for example, love to say that they're not a colonial project because they didn't have a home state, right? So they didn't have a home state that sent them. And I think that both does violence to the history of settler colonialism in general. So even where the French or the British were in control, people came from lots of different places.
Yeah.
And in fact, that created lots of internal divisions. Again, if we can briefly take the example of the Americas, it's very visible because people are Italian American, Irish American, German American, Norwegian American, whatever. Only the old English Protestants are American, you know. But it points to the fact that there was always a lack of a direct translation between, let's say, the nationality of the metropole and necessarily the nationality of the settlers. But the question was, what is the power that is making conquest and domination possible? That is, I think, what's centrally important. And that's the second violence that this argument does, which is that the reason Zionism was possible was British colonization. Is that, of course, the Zionists arrived in Palestine before the British, but the fundamental moment of the beginning of the shifting of the balance of power is when the British take over Palestine after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And they give an institutional framework within which Zionism can operate, grow, and be protected. And in fact, collaborate with the British. So very famously, during the Palestinian revolt, the British are able to mobilize the Zionist labor movement and then the Zionist militias to participate in defeating the general strike and then crushing the military uprising. So there's interplays, but it is the infrastructure of the British Empire that fundamentally shifts the balance of power between Zionism and Palestine. And then at some point, the Zionists, as settlers did in many places, are going to start saying, why do we have to keep listening to the metropole? We want to organize the settler colony ourselves, and also rebelled against the British. But that's, of course, something that, the states that would become the Americas did. It's something that the settlers in Rhodesia, that is today Zimbabwe, did. It's something that the settlers in Algeria tried to do. So you can have struggles between settlers and the metropole. But again, that makes Zionism very much like other settler colonies, rather than an exception in the way that like people talk about.
Yeah, and it's interesting that in the 30s and 40s and after the Balfour Declaration, Britain and the British Empire was playing a key role in facilitating the settler colonialism of the Israelis in Palestine. But now, I believe it has shifted to the US. So now there is a huge link between the Americans and the Israelis. So how can we understand the role of the United States in playing, in supporting or facilitating the Israeli settler colonialism?
There's an Israeli...
Can we, in other words, can we describe the Americans as the metropole of Israel? No?
I wouldn't be opposed to it. I'm not sure we necessarily gain analytical clarity in doing so. What do I mean by that is that there was an Israeli Marxist who lived most of his life in Britain called Yagel Gluckstein. He went by the name of Tony Cliff in Britain. And he used to say Zionism is never for sale. It is always for hire. And what he meant by that was to say that in order to be able to maintain its colonial project, Zionism always needs an imperial backer for military, economic, and diplomatic support. But that the nature of that backer can change. So it was Britain. Then after the Suez Crisis in 1956, the Israeli leadership understands that Britain and France are waning powers and they need to go look somewhere else. And they enter the sphere of influence of the United States. And so I think the primary question is that of imperialism. So the primary question is about in whose imperial project is Israel involved. And the reason I say I'm not sure it adds analytical clarity is that the American empire is not organized through formal colonization abroad, very much at home, but not abroad, in the way that the British or the French were. So it's not to say that the US don't have colonies, they very much do, but that the primary relation is a more indirect one through military and economic integration and relations than the construction of official empires like the British and the French did. So I'm not super precious about it. If people want to think about the US as the metropole, I think it does the job in terms of making sense of the fact that there is a center to the imperial relation which supports the Zionist project in the Middle East, and that Zionism plays a role in its wider imperial project in the region as a whole. That's the important part. And then, we can think about how we want to call it. The other thing I would say is that because that relationship is different than it was with the British and the French, one of the things that's striking, I think, particularly from the 80s and 90s, is that in the neoliberal period, the Israeli economy is deeply integrated directly into the American one. And so that you move from a society that receives support, it still receives support, military support, etc. But you move from a society that receives support to a society that that is integrated directly into the American economy. And so many of the major companies in Israel, of the financial powers in Israel, etc., are either live on the American market rather than on the Israeli one. They are co-owned with American companies, so that Israeli capital or Israeli capitalists can difficultly be extracted from the American economy or from American capital. And so that often I think actually what we're talking about is a deeply integrated, almost unit of shared economic and political interests, both inside of Palestine itself, but also across the region, which again I think helps us make sense of the kind of the closeness of the relationship between the two. I'm a bit hesitant about whether I would call it a metropole or not. But like I say, I think maybe that's less important than, as you say, to understand that the primary relation used to be between Britain and Israel. And then from the early 60s onwards, up to today, is between the United States and Israel.
I was once in a conversation with someone who described himself as a liberal Zionist. And he was he was somehow sympathetic to the Palestinians. And he said that he acknowledges that at the beginning of Israel in 1940s and 50s, Israel was settler colonial, but now it's not anymore settler colonial. And then he said that Israel is now a state and people are being born there, and it's more like any other state. And it's no longer it can no longer be identified as a settler colonial state. And he said now it's a country, it has an army, and people are living there, they grow up there, and they don't have any settler motives. So what do you say about that? What is the difference between the Israeli government and the Israeli army and the Israeli settlers and the Israeli extreme settlers who live in the West Bank and in Golan Heights?
So again, I am not so interested by people's motives. What do I mean by that? Is that this person might very well believe that. And that's fine. But what they can't do away with is material realities within which they live. And so that's what I was saying before, that I think it's useful to think about settler and indigenous as politically constructed identities around rights. And there's wonderful work done by people like Brenna Bandar. Has a great book on, I forget what the book is called, but people can look it up. And Robert Nichols was a book called Theft is Property, where both of them make this argument around the way in which the access to property, who can own property and who can be dispossessed of their property, is really the central piece of these identities, right? Is that, and so a person can be as liberal as they want. They still live in a material reality. If tomorrow they stopped being liberal, they could walk into a Palestinian house and take it, and the state would protect them. Yeah. In fact, they might very well be living in a Palestinian house of a Palestinian family in a camp in Lebanon who's currently being bombed, and that family is not able to return, and they can still live in that house. So they are imbricated in material realities which are profoundly settler colonial. And people can't wish that away through their kind of intentions or the way they understand their situation. And so for me, the question is really one about, what are you committed to? What are you committed to? Are you committed to the rights of Palestinian refugees to return, to equal political, economic, and social rights, to genuine democracy of one person, one vote? Or are you committed to the fact that there should be an ethno-state in which people's political rights, economic rights, social rights, on whatever side, bit of the territory, whether you think you should have all of it, whether you should have half of it, whether it should include Lebanon or not Lebanon, whatever, on whatever part of that territory, that you are committed to a political project in which, because your identification into the settler population, you have a number of rights that are imposed on and against people that are identified as having the right to be dispossessed, murdered, displaced, etc. That for me is the question, much more than how people identify. So, you know, the fact that there are people that are prepared to expand the settler colony into the West Bank, perhaps tomorrow again into Gaza, into southern Lebanon, etc., and others who want to remain in their Arab houses in Jaffa, is sort of less important to me. These are questions about internal debates on strategy, on intensity, on speed, etc., within the settler population. The question for me is one about rights and about material realities and how people are prepared to reorganize a society or not.
Do you describe all the Israeli people as settlers?
So yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I think all of them are settlers and are involved in a settler colonial project. I think sometimes it gets confusing in public discussion because people think about settlers as the people in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. And so sometimes I use that language because I think people who aren't familiar with debates understand it that way. But because I think we have to think about settlement in these kind of structural ways, I think it's absolutely important to recognize that the entire Israeli population is given the rights of a settler population by their state by default as a definitional question. That is what allows their society to exist as an ethno-state in Palestine. And so I guess it depends a bit on what the nature of the discussion is I'm in. But yes, I think it is analytically accurate and important to recognize that the entire Israeli population, wherever they live, is given the rights and the privileges of a settler population.
Interesting. And from your book, we learned that the colonial rule often incorporates elements of ruling classes of indigenous people in order to strengthen their colonial rules. We have seen that very clearly in the British colony of India, for instance. Can you explain more about the process and the process in Palestine? Has the Israelis been doing the same process in Palestine?
So yes and no. Yes, in the sense that Israel has put a lot of emphasis, certainly from the Oslo period onwards, to attempt to integrate layers of Palestinian businessmen into an economy where they have become outrageously rich out of the infrastructure of the occupation. So people who have been allowed to run businesses that, for example, can import and export in and out of the West Bank with Israeli permits, etc. And in that process, become very wealthy and have become very wealthy out of the infrastructure of colonialism. And so these are people who have an economic interest in maintaining the situation as it is. And which has been one of the main critique that many Palestinians have formulated about the kind of the Oslo process, that the Oslo process was primarily inside of Palestine, a process of creating a Palestinian elite that economically profited from maintaining the status quo. And so the work of people like Adam Haniyeh, Tawfiq Haddad, Karim Rabieh is like absolutely central in kind of criticizing the way that operates. And I think it's important to identify the fact that that doesn't only happen in Palestine, but in lots of places, settlers developed political and economic structures that integrated sections of the indigenous ruling class in maintaining a particular infrastructure of or a particular moment, the infrastructure of settler colonialism in a particular moment in a particular place. The reason I say, so for example, the British focused a lot on establishing indigenous leadership in Southern Africa, for example, who were people that they chose because they were politically compliant as sort of the recognized indigenous leadership that they could kind of negotiate with. And that it was also a way, much like the Palestinian Authority is in the West Bank, to sort of outsource part of the repression. That all the repression doesn't need to be done by the settler state. It can also be done at a kind of everyday level by indigenous structures. I also think we have to be a bit careful in not getting things, missing the broader picture, which is that the broader picture remains a settler colonial one in which the settler very much remains in power. And so I think that these elites profit as long as they profit. But in the end, the day that the settler state decides that it's over, it's over. And it's a real debate amongst Israelis for the moment. Parts of the Netanyahu coalition think that the Oslo process has served its purpose, that it's time to do away with its infrastructure with the Palestinian Authority, etc., that Israel should lay claim on everything and destroy these kind of pockets of ruling class Palestinian autonomy. And that, I think, is also important to underline because it points to the fact of not mistaking the balance of power. Yes, there are people who are profiting in particular places at particular times within the indigenous ruling classes, but they only do so as long as the settler state allows them to do that. And the day that the settler state decides that it's over, it will be over.
So how do we understand peace process? The peace process and the ceasefire under the Zionists and under the Zionism and settler colonialism. Do you think there are serious attempts at ending the colonial settlement and the colonial violence against the Palestinian people?
No, I don't.
Plain
In
and
fact,
simple.
plain and simple. I need no further qualifications. No, I don't. I think there's a couple of things to say about Oslo. Is that one, it was a response to major pressure from below, major Palestinian uprising, the most important Palestinian uprising since the 1930s, in which the Israelis and crucially the Americans believed that it was necessary to pivot in order to regain control over the situation. And so to be seen to look like what they were doing was to prepare to negotiate with the Palestinians. I think the second thing that happened was a real attempt by the United States in the aftermath of the Cold War to normalize Israel within the wider Middle East. And that was a real emphasis of American strategy. It remains a real emphasis of American strategy, which is that Israel, as the main political and economic expression of American power in the region, needed to be integrated into the region through agreements with the ruling classes of the Arab states in order to strengthen American power. So the peace treaties between Egypt, Jordan, and Israel, for example, were primarily ways in which Egypt and Jordan took the knee to the American empire.
Okay.
And in fact, making peace with Israel and opening economic relations with Israel was a precondition for the states to have access to the American market. And the Oslo process made that possible because from the Oslo process, the Egyptian peace treaty is older than the Oslo process. But the Oslo process allowed to accelerate those deals because once the Oslo process was signed, once the agreement was signed or the negotiations were ongoing, America and Israel could say to the states of the region, well, look, if the Palestinians are prepared to talk to us, why would you not talk to us? And many of these ruling classes who don't really care about the Palestinians, but are forced by popular pressure, their populations care about the Palestinians, but the regimes don't. They were able to say to their populations, look, the PLO is negotiating with the Israelis, so we can too. And what you see throughout the 90s and the early 2000s is that you have a number of summits, the MENA summits, the Middle East and North Africa summits, sponsored by the United States, in which free trade agreements are signed between Arab states and the United States. And a precondition of signing those agreements is to recognize Israel. So that the integration of Israel into the region is part of solidifying American influence across the region as well. And the Abraham Accords are the kind of last step of that, which is that they're sort of called peace treaties. But of course, they're not peace treaties because they're signed between Israel and its closest allies in the region. None of these people are at war. Morocco is not at war with Israel. Bahrain, the UAE. None of these people are at war. Saudi Arabia in the background. None of them are at war with Israel. It's a solidification of the closest allies of the United States between each other at a time where the United States is trying to be able to get out of the Middle East and focus on China and let its allies run the region, basically. And so the Oslo process is the beginning of making that possible. So that's the second thing. One is to respond to Palestinian resistance and uprising in the First Intifada. The second one is to accelerate the normalization and the integration of Israel in the region. And the third one is to generate an outsourcing for the occupation, which is this process we were talking about, which is to create a Palestinian Authority, which will be a police force in Palestine. And so you see Palestinian political activists being arrested by the Palestinian Authority before the Israelis ever get involved, for example. And generating a Palestinian elite which moves away from the process of national liberation and sees its direct economic interests in maintaining the status quo and the illusion of the two-state solution and therefore stabilize a situation that's deeply unstable and in which Palestinians are fighting back.
But some people would say that the PA, during the Second Intifada, for example, they were part of the resistance against Israel. They participated in the armed resistance against Israel. And some people would argue that even in the West Bank right now, the Fatah militants who belong to the security apparatus in the West Bank, they do fight Israel militarily.
Yeah, so I think it's important, and that's also why I say it's important not to miss the nature of the relationship. The relationship primarily remains one, structured and organized by the settler state, and of conflict between indigenous and settlers in that kind of context. And so, of course, the infrastructures that are built to control can collapse in lots of ways. And so you're absolutely right that the infrastructure that was originally built between the first and the second Intifada comes to falter during the second Intifada. Arafat also recognizes that it was a strategic mistake and appears to be changing his mind. As you say, parts of the Palestinian police forces or turn their weapons on the occupation. All of that takes place, and it's part of the reasons why the second Intifada lasts so long and that the repression is so violent and absolute, because it's crushing all of those elements in order to re-establish the infrastructure. And what's striking, of course, is that after the second Intifada, despite those moments of break, that infrastructure is maintained, is that Israel continues to see its use once the people who rebelled within it were dealt with. Which is also, by the way, why I think it's so important to generate, for the Israelis, to generate a kind of an economic elite, because those are people who don't only need to be repressed to maintain the structure. They have their own interests to do so. But of course, that infrastructure can still collapse. And so we've seen small examples of that in the West Bank of the PA police, elements in the PA police kind of saying, like, we can't keep doing this. Like, we obviously have to respond to the kind of the barbaric military assaults that are taking place inside the West Bank. And I think it's absolutely possible that we'll continue to see that. So, and again, I think it's important to make a difference between, and it's a bit the discussion we were having about elimination. There is always a difference, and I try to kind of argue that in the book, between what the colonizer wants and what the colonizer is able to do. Is that the Oslo process is a number of strategies that are followed by the colonizers and their backers to stabilize a situation that they worry they're losing control over. The fact that that is the logic doesn't mean that it always is what comes out of it. And that's much more contradictory, not least because the fact that two constants in any colonial situation is the violence necessary to maintain it and the fact that people fight back against it. Is that violence generates continuously forms of resistance, military, economic, political, social, whatever it might be, lots of different forms of resistance that are continuously mobilized in response to the kind of the violence of colonial rule, including within the structures. And so, for example, the last thing I'll say is one of the things that's striking is that it's often within the infrastructures of colonially supported indigenous structures. So, for example, in Southern Africa, the structures that were imposed by the colonial state as forms of so-called indigenous self-rule, very much the case in the Americas, by the way, as well, that those structures are very contradictory. Because on the one hand, they generate control. On the other hand, they create spaces of indigenous life. And within these spaces of indigenous life, forms of resistance emerge. And so that tension is also why I'm saying we shouldn't lose out of sight the fact that overall, the settler colonial question remains dominant. Because those strategies settler states can lose control over those strategies, which is very much something that we saw not only in the settler colonial world, across the colonial world, which is that elites that the colonizing states thought they could control as part of their ways to establish stability over their colonial dominions, at some point started rebelling and they lost control over it. And so that tension is only, you can only identify it or understanding it by not losing sight that above all those forms is primarily and first and foremost always the settler colonial state.
In your book, you also wrote about the concept of indigenizing the settler population. So do you think Israel or the Israeli state is seeking to indigenize its settler population in Palestine and erase the Palestinian culture and history?
Yes.
In what way?
So I think, so first of all, maybe to say that like that process describes the way in which settlers present themselves. And in that sense, it's not disconnected from the question you were asking me about this person you were talking to who says like, well, now, sure, it was a colonial process, but now we're locals, you know, we've been here all this time, etc., which is to start doing a way to hide the power relations that I've been saying over and over again are so central. So to do away with the fact that what allows the settler colony to exist is brute force. And again, we're getting a very clear sense of the amount of brute force necessary to stabilize domination in Palestine today. But to do away, to hide the brute force that is necessary by generating a kind of an image of normalcy. And so to say that actually the settler population belongs here in a totally uncomplicated way. In fact, they belong here more than the people who claim to have been here before they arrived. And so how does that take place in Palestine? The changing of names, right? So Palestinian names for places are changed by Hebrew names. In fact, I saw the other day that the BBC described the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, right? So like a process of, you can see how something that would have only happened, again, the connection between the most extreme settlers and just settler colonialism in general. So a word that would only have been used in the most extreme kind of cases of the settler movement, maybe even a decade ago still, being so normalized today that like the BBC would use it to talk about the West Bank. So changing names, claiming parts of indigenous life as Israeli. So the most obvious probably in Palestine is the question of cuisine, right? So like lots of, and people sort of tend to, can sometimes say like, oh, that seems a bit petty or whatever to like focus on that. But actually it captures exactly this process, which is say this food that uses local agricultural outputs that is clearly connected to the kind of the wider societal realities of the region within which the colony exists. This food is not actually Palestinian food, it is Israeli food. Which, by the way, in the process also does away with the very long history of Jewish presence in the Arab world, in which populations ate the same food, but not because it's Israeli food, but because those people were also Arabs or also Persians or Kurds or Berbers or whatever it might be. The destruction of Palestinian life, the doing away with villages, with Palestinian neighborhoods, with populations, with literally physically erasing the society that existed in order to build on top of it the society the settler society that's being built. And in some ways that can also take contradictory shapes over time. So for example, after the Nakba, one of the things that's striking is that in many places, Palestinian houses remained. So if you walk in Haifa today, the Palestinian neighborhoods in Haifa, or some of the Palestinian neighborhoods in Haifa are still there. They're empty, they're in ruins, but you have a sort of open air museum to the Nakba. Difficult not to read that as an everyday reminder to the Palestinians that remained of what is possible, of the kind of violence that can be done. In many places, the rubble of the destroyed Palestinian neighborhoods remained for a very long time. So like in Jaffa, for example, where half of the city was bulldozed, for a very long time, the rest of the city just remained as a kind of a sign of colonial power. But over time, that starts being done away with. So the rubble in Jaffa is covered by a park. It's a park now next to the sea. Lovely little park that you can go on a walk, but you're standing on top of Palestinian houses that were destroyed. Arab houses go from being abandoned to be turned into luxury houses that at one point nobody wanted, and now it's like the chicest thing that you can own. And so it goes from being a sign a memory of Palestinian dispossession to a process of indigenization. This house that's been here for however long, much longer than the Israeli state, today is the house of an Israeli rather than the house of Palestinians. And so it's the ongoing process of disappearing from view the violence, the dispossession, the murder that makes a particular relationship of power possible, and hiding it by making it look like archaeology is a famous example in Israel, where Israeli archaeologists, and this has been criticized by lots of people, will continue digging until they find rests of Jewish presence, and so they will dig through Ottoman findings or Arab findings until they find something that they can claim. They will also make claims that are very difficult to substantiate. They will say something is obviously from a particular period or from a Jewish kingdom, etc., in ways that are very much debated or debunked by other archaeologists. I a year and a half ago was in a research center in East Jerusalem to do research, and an archaeologist was staying in the same research center, young archaeologist, who was telling me that the word people use on Israeli archaeological sites for anything after the presence of Jewish kingdoms in Palestine is post-interesting. So people will find stuff and they'll say, oh, this is post-interesting. So it's post the eras that they're interested in finding, because what they're trying to show is continuous Jewish presence on the land, which they then nationalize, right? Because in a sense, Jewish presence on the land at any time is actually irrelevant in terms of the building of a colonial state. But they obviously claim that justifies the existence of the colonial state. And anything that's after that is of no interest. Yeah. If you go to Israeli museums, you'll have a lot of history up until the end of Jewish presence in Palestine. And then you'll have a few lines about the hundreds of years in the middle, thousands of years in the middle. And then lots of details again from the late 19th century as European Jewish populations arrive. And so it's the continuous erasure of the existence of different populations, different societies, different nations, different tribes, whatever it might be, in the land that is being colonized, while the settler population is being presented as having always been there and the only kind of legitimate power in the land.
How does the international law view settler colonialism?
So I'm not an international lawyer and I can't say very much about it. What I can say is maybe more kind of sort of commonplace, which is that one of the problems in international law is that it emerges very much within the context of colonization. And that it emerges as a way to organize the relations between colonial states. And so one of the problems is that international law recognizes states. And so if people are denied statehood, they are denied access to the infrastructure of international law. And that's a real contradiction, a real problem that plays itself all the time in international institutions, which the Palestinian leadership is trying to deal with by getting access or recognition as a Palestinian state, even on a majorly reduced little part of the land in Palestine, because then they would have access to the structures of the international community. But of course, what that captures, I think, is the fact that the imposition of the nation state is, we often get that wrong, is that we start by saying the nation state emerges in Europe and then fans out. Actually, the history is more complicated. The emergence of borders, hard borders, lines in the sand, emerges in the colonial process. The first of them being when the Pope decides that he's going to divide the new world between Spain and Portugal. And so he draws a line, and he says on this side of the line, it's Portuguese. And so you have what's today kind of the east of Brazil and the west coast of Africa. That's Portuguese. And everything on the west of that line is Spanish. That is the beginning of the abstract idea of a border. The border is no longer as it was before, spheres of influence around urban centers and actually very unclear borders between who actually rules what. And you get this idea of an abstract line that is a border alongside which sovereignty is imposed. But that process of sovereignty, the doctrine of discovery is another one that gives the power to European states to claim to have discovered land, raising the obvious now question of how can you discover land in which millions of people live? You're not discovering something, you're conquering it.
Yeah.
Or you're entering in contact with it, but in this case, you're conquering it. But the doctrine of discovery gave the right to European nations to claim sovereignty, to establish power over land that they were quote unquote discovering, i.e. conquering, and did away with the kind of the claims. And so the problem at a very basic level, and you probably would do better to invite an international lawyer to talk about it much more intelligently than me. But the fundamental problem is that these rules are established to maintain the relations between colonizing powers, and by definition does away with recognizing the sovereignty of indigenous populations. Part of that infrastructure is, of course, challenged by the process of decolonisation throughout the 20th century, in which many formerly colonized states enter the recognition of statehood with all of its contradictions, because it also reinforces particular international power relations, etc. But many of these populations remain invisible because of the continued denial of their statehood. And that's a real, very much something that plays itself out in Palestine, with obviously all the ways in which lots of brilliant Palestinian and other international lawyers are now trying to mobilize some of these weapons to, raise the kind of the demands of the Palestinian people, etc. So, it's again, there's a difference between the desires and the wishes of colonial powers and how people are actually able to resist and mobilize the tools against them. But that's the fundamental tension, which is that these are rules that are established between colonial powers and that by definition deny the existence and the rights of those that are denied recognition as states or as political entities.
Does settler colonialism and Zionism explain Israel's violence in Lebanon today?
So I think it does, as long as settler colonialism, like I said before, is not abstracted out of the wider networks of imperialism and capital accumulation. So if we make sense of the fact that the reason first Britain and then the United States sponsored settlement in Palestine and continue to do so is primarily about securing a key crossroads of the world economy, then yes, it makes sense, because this is the reason. This is the exchange, in a sense, is that as long as Israel functions as the loyal little Ulster or the unsinkable airplane carrier of empire in the region, the exchange is that its colonial project will be supported. And so it very much it's very much part of one unified picture that Israel serves as a military expression of Western imperialism in the region. And I think that's what we're seeing. I think we're seeing the Israeli state acting on behalf of the United States primarily, but not only, in the region, using the moment of crisis as a historical opportunity to weaken its main enemies. And so clearly it is also seen as an opportunity to weaken Hezbollah. And now, as we're recording, we're hearing that both Syria and Yemen are also being hit. The question of Iran remains looming large, etc. And this is very much in line with how Israel behaved in the period of Arab nationalism, where its main role was to break the back of primarily Egypt and also Syria in a series of kind of military confrontations in the name very much of Western power in the region. And the exchange is that these same powers that back it will continue to support its colonial expansion. And then the other thing is what you've already said, which is that there are part of the Zionist movement, that see the south of Lebanon as part of the territory that is to be settled. And, there's real questions about whether or not Israel will try to reestablish control over the south of Lebanon up to the Litani River or not. And, history is playing itself out in front of us, so it's too early to say. But so it could also involve direct expansion of territorial control. But even if it doesn't, the two can't be dissociated. Israel's military and economic, by the way, expression of power across the region in the name of its imperial backers cannot be separated from the expansion of its settlement program.
And now looking back at the decolonization of the other settler colonial societies, do you think that do you think there are any signs that Israel is entering its final stage, as the academic and historian Ilan Babé has argued?
I have to say that I struggle to see what Babé is seeing or what others are seeing. And the reason I say that is I think that the idea of terminal decline is based on a number of internal readings that I don't see as signs of internal decline. So, for example, the idea that the very right wing of the Zionist movement is in control and that they are considered to be irrational, etc. The idea that in the process of genocide, clearly, politically and economically, there are real signs of kind of crisis and weakness inside of Israel. I think that's true, but I don't see them as existential threats. I think they are temporary signs in a moment of major military confrontation. And the reason I don't see them as signs of terminal decline is because I think these analyses fail to see the driving role of Western power behind Israel. And so that as long as Israel serves the military, economic interests of strategic interests, etc., of the United States and Europe more broadly, those states will bail them out. And in fact, it's what we're seeing. And so I think we shouldn't confuse short-term crisis with long-term unsolvable crisis, let's say. And actually what we're seeing is that on the one hand, the relationship between Western imperialism and Israel remains very solid, and that the infrastructure of imperialism that's been built over decades that I was talking about before, the normalization of Israel with the Arab regimes, is actually surviving in the crisis. And I think that as long as those two things survive, we are not in a situation where we can say that Israel is entering a period of fundamental crisis. Now, is that therefore a sign of, Israel's all-powerfulness? No. And I think it's also true that the masks are off. I think they are off for the peoples of the world, where it wasn't off already. And I think they are off also for the peoples of the region in terms of what that means for their own regime's complicity into the genocide in Palestine, the massacres now in Lebanon, etc. And that, I think, should be for us the main question. Why do I say that? So I remain very much convinced by the analyses that were made by the Palestinian left in the 60s and 70s, which said that there is something which might appear contradictory, which is that because of the international nature of Zionism and its regional character, it has influence and power well beyond its borders. But that also means that there are lots of ways in which it can be weakened and fought. Now, that's, of course, on the one hand, in terms of the West, the demands of the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, is very clear on that because of the fact that Israel is dependent on its ongoing military, economic, political, diplomatic, etc. relations with the West. We have a direct responsibility and ability to act by cutting the supply lines. Breaking all institutional state company relations between our own institutions, states, companies, and Israel. So that's one. The second one, and perhaps the more important one, is that the Palestinian left always put the emphasis on regional liberation. That because Zionism is not only, it is of course primarily, but not only about Palestine, it's about control over the region as a whole, that the fundamental transformation of relations in the region, of power relations in the region, would change the usefulness of Israel for the Western powers that back it. What does that mean? I think we got a really good, and so, the Palestinian left had these slogans. They would say, the liberation of Palestine, the road to Jerusalem starts in Cairo, it starts in Damascus, depending on the kind of period. But so he was saying that the revolutions against the Arab regimes go hand in hand with the question of liberation of Palestine. Why? I think we got a glimpse of that in 2011. As the revolutions around the region spread, everywhere, people made the connection between their liberation and Palestinian liberation. Everywhere people said, for us to get rid of our repressive regimes is also to open the road towards Palestinian liberation. Breaking the normalization with Israel, breaking economic ties with Israel, kicking out the ambassadors, the Israeli ambassadors out of the Arab world. Everywhere, those actions and those demands were absolutely central to the uprising because people made the connection, rightly so, between their oppression by their regimes, Western imperialism, and the role that Israel plays in that. And what that means is that I think even before we talk about the full radical potential of those revolutions, exit out of capitalism, the possibility of drawing up a different world, all of that, which were only ever potentials, but the most radical potentials. Even just the question, I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but even only the question of democratization of the region would put on the table normalization with Israel. Any actually democratic regime in the region would be forced to break relations, economic and political relations with Israel, because they don't represent the will of their people. And that would put American and European imperialism in front of a question. Do they need to maintain relations with generally democratic regimes in the region, or do they need to maintain relations with their military representatives in the region? Now, first, they might choose military repression. But if that fails, that is the moment where we could start seeing Western imperialism breaking relations with Israel and opening a whole host of new political possibilities for the Palestinian national liberation movement and for regional liberation more generally. And so that actually the imperial character of Israel is not only important to understand settler colonialism properly, but also to start thinking about liberation. And that's why the Palestinian left talked about Palestinian liberation being part of regional liberation, why Hassan Kanafani talked about the enemy trinity, right? So he talked about imperialism, the Palestinian ruling classes, and the Arab regimes. And this idea that all forms of liberation, struggles for liberation in the region are connected to one another. And it seems to me that that's what we kind of have to hang on to in this period.
We did a podcast on Hassan Kanafani last time.
Right.
Our previous podcast was on Hassan Kanafani, and we discussed why Hassan Kanafani thinks that it is imperative that all oppressed people fight imperialism everywhere, all around the world, because if you fight it here, then you fight it everywhere. But we will go back to the liberation and return that you discussed a lot in your book. But now I know you're not a media expert, but I can't help but ask you this question because I am interested in media. Now we have established that what's happening in Palestine is settler colonialism, and within the academic and the activist sphere, so many people, like maybe the majority of academics, believe that Zionism or what's happening in Palestine is settler colonialism or colonialism at worst cases. But we haven't heard in the media anyone who talk about this topic. We never hear in the Western media the word settler colonialism. Why do you think is that?
Well, look, I think the media is not neutral, right? It represents the power relations, the dominant power relations in the society within which it operates. And so, we see that very much, the way in which the vast majority of our media reports on Palestine. I mean, you don't even have to go to settler colonialism. The way in which death is acknowledged, murder, right? Israelis are murdered, Palestinians just die, right? People make sort of dark humor about the fact that the greatest enemy of the Palestinians is the passive voice, right? Is that like everything is always passive. There is no actor here. Colonization just happens. People just lose their homes. People are killed. People are expelled. It just happens somewhere. So we're not even at the question of settler colonialism. Is that the dominant question of British, in our case, interest in the region sets the limits of what is acceptable for these institutions to say, how to understand the situation. And that's because, their owners often are very wealthy businessmen who share the same interest as our states, or they are, in the case of the BBC, government appointees who very much share the political and economic interests of our states, etc. And so that what is possible in the media is very much shaped by the general political situation. What I would say is it's becoming a bit of a theme, is that to understand power is also not to give it absolute agency. And so that the fact that things become generally understood and used in academia or in social movements, that people fight for them, etc., has real consequences. I think the question of apartheid is interesting here, which is that when I was a student and we were in the process of doing the first Israeli apartheid weeks, saying apartheid was like unheard of. People thought, it was unacceptable. How could you make a comparison with South Africa? Blah, 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 etc. Now, many of these arguments haven't disappeared, except nearly 2 decades later, apartheid's being used in the UN. It's being used in legal cases. It's increasingly being used, or actually it might even be a dominant framework at this point in academic writing. The ongoing struggles of the Palestinian national movements and movement and its allies shapes and reshapes the limits of the possible. And in a sense, I think that's partly what we're seeing with settler colonialism. I mean, the fact that, there are now very much outliers, but people within international institutions that use the language of settler colonialism is also the outcome of over half a century now of Palestinians and their allies fighting for that analytical framework to be understood, not simply as a political argument, but as a way that allows us to make sense analytically, politically, of what is going on and the framework within which we can understand it, and therefore also the framework in which it can be resolved.
And you talked about the process of settlement and capitalist development, and you said that it is very important that all of us, fight imperialism and colonialism. Why do you think it's important for all of us, not only the people who live under imperialism and colonized, should fight settler colonialism? Why all of us?
Because I am very hesitant or very unconvinced by attempts to separate things out. So to say you have imperialism here, you have colonialism there, you have capitalism here. One of the things I try to say in the book, and again, many people have said this, is that there is no capitalism without imperialism, without colonization, etc. And so that actually all of us who live under a system that exploits us, that destroys the planet by through the kind of engineered ecological disasters that we live through. Maybe engineered isn't the right word, but human-made ecological disasters that emerge out of processes of hyper exploitation and extraction. All of us that are repressed when violently, often when we try to democratically organize for the world that we'd like to see, etc. We all live under a shared economic and political system in which we experience different elements of it. And so in the same way that, somebody like Kanafani could talk about weakening imperialism anywhere is weakening it everywhere, I think weakening capitalism anywhere is weakening it everywhere. And this is where I think people sometimes miss also the full radical nature of, for example, a movement like the BDS movement. Which is that on the one hand, the Palestinian people are making a simple demand on the rest of the world, which is to say, your companies, governments, institutions make you co-complicit of our colonial subjugation, and you should end that complicity. So on one hand, that's already important. But the second one is that actually in doing that, the Palestinians or the Palestinian national movement is giving us a tool to transform our own society. Because what is it saying? It is saying you should fight for a democratic right to control the political, economic, and diplomatic decisions of your institutions, your companies, and your government. That's a radical form of rethinking how our society should be used. Now, I agree with that. We shouldn't be ruled by the needs and the desires of capital. We should be ruled by our collective interests, desires, and political visions. And for that, we need a radical democratization of our society. BDS is one of the tools that points us in that direction, that says the liberation of Palestine and the fundamental reshaping of your own society have to go hand in hand in the kind of solidarity work you do. It's not about charity. It's not about saying, poor people over there. It's about saying the enemies we face in very, very different situations. And, we shouldn't sort of pretend that we are somehow in a situation that's comparable to what's happening in Palestine. We face the same enemy in very different situations. And to weaken that enemy is to advance all of our liberations. And so it's also why in the book I put so much emphasis at the beginning that to understand the emergence of capitalism, its spread around the world, its development, its intensification throughout the 19th century, etc., you have to understand colonialism in general and settler colonialism in this case. Because then to think about how to defeat both, we can start thinking about what kind of connections to lay in and how the two kind of operate hand in hand.
In your last chapter, you talked about liberation and return. And then one of them was, one of the headlines was From the River to the Sea. You talked about the ways in which the Palestinian resistance, whether it was like peaceful or armed struggle, they impacted the advancement of the settler colonialism. And then you talked about the Great March of Return and Sheikh Jarrah movement and the Intifada unity. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Yeah. So I guess it's a bit the theme that's run through our discussion, which is to say that I think we have to be very careful, particularly when we study forms of domination, that we don't end up reproducing them in a sense, that we end up showing them as all-powerful. I think that's a real difficulty. Certainly when you talk about over 500 years, the history of European colonization, you can sort of end up being like, well, here are these extraordinary amounts of global expressions of violence, of power, of elimination, of exploitation, of extraction, etc. And you can end up actually doing the opposite of what you're trying to do, which is you end up reproducing a sense that these things are unchallengeable. And so it's always the question of thinking about what the contradictions are between the desires of those who dominate and the responses by those who are being dominated. And that the responses of those who are being dominated continuously challenge, redirect, halt, stop, contradict, etc. Those of the oppressors and the exploiters. And I think that's really central. There's I forget who now, but I mentioned it in the book. Indigenous scholars, I've forgotten who it is. People will have to look in the book. Who say, what's the point of writing about settler colonialism if it's not to think about how we get out of it? And I think that's really important. Because, of course, part of the history of the last 50 to 100 years is not only the history of expansion, it's actually also the history of defeat of colonial powers, of independence, of successful anti-colonial struggles, of international forms of solidarity, of history shaping revolutions in which millions of people reshaped the world around them for the better. Many of these movements are later kind of redefeated or pushed back in different ways, but it's an ongoing struggle that I think we all participate in. And so that's the kind of underlying question that I sort of try to come back to. And so we've already talked about it in different ways, but there is always an interplay between what a colonial power tries to do and what the colonized do in response. And you see that in the Palestinian national movement. that we talked about the Arab Revolt in the 30s, and you probably talked about it with Hazem Jamjoom when you talked about the book about the Arab Revolt, and the way in which a general strike was organized in order to weaken the colonial economy and demand independence. As that general strike was defeated, people moved into military confrontation with the British state and got very close, actually, to taking control over most of Palestine in that period. It's probably the closest the Palestinian national movement gets to achieving independence. It is defeated, which leads to the Nakba, to expulsion, etc. But even in the process of expulsion, there is the reorganization of the Palestinian national movements in the camps. And the PLO is largely the expression, the political expression of a refugee population thinking about what we were talking about, the international networks of imperialism and how to fight those in order to liberate Palestine. But at the same time, you also have the reorganization of Palestinian political life within Palestine. We talked about how Palestinians are integrated into the Israeli economy after 1967, which leads to new forms of resistance, of strike action, of trade union, of social movements that lay the foundation for the First Intifada. And the First Intifada exploits in a different way the contradictions generated by Israeli colonialism, because Palestinians mobilized both their political and their economic power within Palestine on a massive scale, comparable, although also different, to that of the 1930s. And then you get the moment of Oslo, of attempted re-separation, which means that the Second Intifada and the violence of Israeli repression expresses itself much more in a military way than an economic or social way. But it's again a way to think about how resistance is possible. And so in every generation, you see the Palestinian national movement reorganizing itself in different places, in different forms, mobilizing the contradictions that are generated by the colonial project in order to try to defeat it. And so the different examples I look at in the book, I think, point to a reorganization after the Second Intifada in lots of different parts of the Palestinian people, whether it's the social movements in the West Bank against the Fayyad government, whether it's the Great March of Return in Gaza, whether it's the youth movement, the Talat movement, the Unity Intifada, etc., in 48, etc., that rejects the Oslo process, that stops thinking about Palestinians as divided different groups, but actually as a unified people fighting in different places, that makes the question of settler colonialism and national liberation central again to the language of liberation, and tries to find in very important and inspiring ways new forms to organize in a new situation faced with the kind of the limitations of the past. In a sense, I also think that's true in terms of the resistance in Gaza, which is that the unbelievable violence of the blockade generates new contradictions, which is, on the one hand, you have 2.5 million people, 2.3 million people blocked in 365 square kilometers, in which their food is limited, in which rebuilding materials is limited, where Israel controls absolutely everything that comes in and out, and in which on a regular basis the so-called mowing the grass operations, which are the kind of mass murder campaigns of Israel in the Gaza Strip, take place. You can imagine that that's a population that is entirely defeated. What worse form of colonial violence can you imagine than the kind of 18 years of blockade that the people of Gaza put in? At the same time, it also generates blind spots for the Israeli occupation because it's not in Gaza. And that is what the resistance then mobilizes in order to break out of Gaza for the first time in 18 years in ways that nobody saw coming. And in the space of just those minutes, even forget of anything else, just the minutes of breaking out of Gaza that happened a year ago from now, what happens is that the whole architecture of control in the region is being questioned. The question of normalization, with Israel, the question that the Palestinians could just be wished away, which is what Netanyahu did a few weeks before the 7th of October. Netanyahu was at the UN saying the new Middle East, in which he showed a map of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, in which any of Palestine had disappeared altogether. There was only Israel on his map. This was his new Middle East. Everybody had said it was over. And even in that situation of extraordinary repression and violence on an unimaginable scale, resistance reemerges. Resistance reemerges, and the question of Palestine is put right back at the center of all international discussions, whether they are in the region or whether in the rest of the world. And so the level of violence, the level of repression, the level of massacre, the genocide we're seeing is the response not only of Israel, but also of the United States to having been challenged in the place where they least thought it was still possible of any challenge kind of coming to the fore. And so what that points to, I think, is the impossibility at the heart of systems of oppression in general and of colonialism in particular, which is the extraordinary violence that it requires to keep millions of people oppressed and exploited in that way. And the fact that that violence always ends up generating new forms of responses and of resistance against it, that I think we have to kind of hold on to in our abilities to think about how it is possible to think about these systems of oppression and exploitation to be defeated and a different kind of world to be built out.
When we talk about liberation, return, and the decolonization of Palestine, what does that even mean? What does it mean, the decolonization of Palestine? Is it possible? And if yes, will we see it in our lifetime?
Is it possible? Yes. Will we see it in our lifetime? That question will be fought over. And so, like I say, I think very much, I remain convinced of the analyses of the Palestinian left that saw the liberation of Palestine as regional, as being a mass movement, and one that would come through the overthrowing of oppressive regimes across the region, which would weaken Western imperialism and therefore their reliance on Israel. That, to me, remains the central question. Now, what exactly would it look like? I don't know. And in a sense, it's not really for me to say in general, and certainly not now and from here. These questions will be resolved in the process of struggle, in the process of liberation, where the Palestinian national movements and its allies around the region will have to deal with real material questions. What I do think, though, is that what the framework of settler colonialism allows us to think about is this question of what does decolonization mean? If we say that the fundamental structure of a settler colony is the distribution of rights, resources, wealth, etc., from one people to another, one people having the right to dispossess, displace, murder, and another people having the right to be displaced, be dispossessed, be murdered. The fundamental question needs to be one of ending that framework. It needs to be the end of that distribution of rights and of power. And I think, we've seen that in different places take place around the world. And so, people often point to South Africa. And I think South Africa is both useful as a good and a bad example. Good as an example of the fact that settler colonialism can end and that it can be defeated, as many others are across the world. And that in that defeat, you can think of a whole host of different forms of social life between populations that were at very different kind of ends of the colonial experience. Also bad in terms of the dangers of not doing away fully with the material structures that we've kind of been talking about as being central to the colonial process. So land wasn't redistributed. Property wasn't fundamentally altered. So inequality, the structures of inequality in South Africa survived. And in fact, in the neoliberal period, worsened. And so inequality today is bigger in South Africa than it was in 1994. So it both points to the possibilities and to the dangers and the limitations. And I think hopefully also the study of colonialism or settler colonialism is helpful in terms of thinking about what are the kind of the better and the worst examples of history in terms of what the negotiations, the power struggles, the struggle for liberation will need to achieve to make liberation real and possible in Palestine, across the region, and across the world. It is very much possible, but it needs to be fought for. And the Palestinian national movement has been very clear on what we in the international community or across the world are being asked to do, which is weaken the Israeli state as much as possible by cutting its political, economic, and diplomatic support and military support that it receives from the West, in order to open the space as much as possible for the Palestinian national movement to operate and to organize and to fight for freedom.
Sai, thank you very, very, very much for joining us. It was very useful.
Thank you so much.
Very helpful. And I encourage everyone to have a copy of this book, Settler Colonialism, an Introduction by Sai Englert.
As Israel attempts to erase the Palestinian people under the cover of darkness, targeting journalists and censoring the press, we must rise from the ashes. At Palestine Deep Dive, we are building a multimedia space where our voices, the Palestinian voices, are always front and center. And right now, we just need 3,000 more of you to join our regular supporters and back our work so we can rapidly expand our output. Help us build the future of journalism. Become a supporter at PalestineDeepDive.com/support. This is 100% independent media powered by you.